The rain didn't just fall in Chicago, it punished. It slicked the pavement outside the Elks Club, reflecting the neon predatory glow of a city that belonged to Atlas Moreau. Briar stood shivering, her silk dress clinging to her skin like a second, cold layer of nerves. She had just watched Atlas negotiate a peace treaty with the tip of a fountain pen and the threat of a silencer, and her heart hadn't stopped hammering since. "The car is 2 minutes out, Mr. Moreau," she said, her voice a forced blade of professional steel despite the water dripping from her hair. She reached for her phone to check the GPS, but a heavy, warm hand clamped over her forearm. The heat of his palm was an electric shock against her chilled skin. Atlas stepped into her space, his shadow swallowing her whole. The scent of expensive bourbon and rain-dampened cedarwood filled her lungs. He didn't look at the street, he looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her throat where a pulse jumped frantically. "Cancel the car to your place, Briar," he rasped, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in her chest. "You're going home with me tonight. Hello, my beautiful family. I'm so glad you found your way back to our circle today. Before we dive in, take a second to just breathe and leave the noise of the world behind. If you're new here, welcome home, you're already one of us. Hit that subscribe button to keep our family growing, and let me know in the comments where you're joining from. Now, get comfortable, and let's step into today's story." The car Atlas summoned was not a car. It was a statement. A black Escalade with tinted windows that didn't just block light but seemed to absorb it entirely, flanked by 2 trailing vehicles she'd never seen before tonight. Standing on the rain-slicked curb, Briar counted 4 men materializing from the club's shadow perimeter before she'd even finished processing the fact that her entire evening had just been rerouted without her consent. She got in because there was no version of refusing Atlas Moreau on a rain-soaked sidewalk at midnight that didn't end in humiliation. She told herself that. She repeated it twice. The drive lasted 19 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on her phone with the focused intensity of someone defusing something. Atlas sat beside her in the dark interior, not touching her, not speaking, one arm rested along the back of the seat in a way that wasn't possessive and somehow was anyway. He smelled exactly as he had outside, bourbon and cedarwood and rain. And the confined space made it worse. Or better. She wasn't prepared to examine which. His men didn't speak either. That was the thing about the Moreau syndicate that had taken her the longest to absorb when she'd first taken the job. The silence wasn't empty. It was structural. It held weight, and you learned to read it the way you learned to read weather, not what it was, but what it meant was coming. What came was Lakeshore Drive, and then a building that had no visible signage, and then an elevator that required a key and a biometric scan and apparently Atlas's specific exhale, because the doors didn't open until he was standing directly in front of the panel. The penthouse was not what she'd imagined. She realized, stepping into it, that she had imagined it, cataloged some ambient version of this space during 3 years of managing his schedule, forwarding his correspondence, sitting across from him in boardrooms that always seemed slightly too warm when he entered them. She had imagined something aggressive. Cold marble and hard angles, a place designed to intimidate. Instead, it was quiet in a way that felt almost biological, like something that breathed. The ceilings were high and the lighting was low and amber, and every surface that wasn't glass looking out over a rain-blurred Chicago skyline was dark wood or leather worn soft by actual use. There were books, not decorative books arranged by color, but books that had been read, spines creased, a few left open and face down in the specific carelessness of someone who'd been interrupted mid-thought. A chess set on a low table near the window had a game in progress, though she couldn't imagine who he played with. It looked, against all reason, like someone lived here. "Bathrooms through the primary," Atlas said, moving to a bar cart with the ease of a man in the only room in the world where he didn't have to calculate anything. "There are clothes in the second closet. Take whatever fits." Briar stood in the center of the room with her wet dress plastered to her legs and her heels in her hand. She'd removed them in the elevator without thinking, a reflex towards self-preservation, and she felt the specific vertigo of a person who has just stepped off a map. I have an apartment, she said. I have a very functional apartment with my own clothes in it. Compromised. He said it the way he said everything, like a period at the end of a sentence, not a comma. She turned to look at him. He was pouring something dark into a crystal glass, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeves pushed to the elbow, and she could see the tattoos continuing down his forearms in dense, precise geometry. In 3 years she had never seen him without a jacket. It felt like an intimacy she hadn't agreed to. What do you mean compromised? I mean Saren's people were outside your building before we left the club. He looked at her then, over the rim of the glass. My team intercepted 2 of them. A third got away. He paused. You would have walked into that. The information landed slowly, the way cold does, first at the surface, then all the way through. You knew this at the club, she said. It wasn't a question. I knew at the moment Saren's lieutenant left the table early. He set the glass down. I knew it before I put my hand on your arm. Something about that phrasing, before I put my hand on your arm, rearranged itself in her chest in a way she didn't have the bandwidth to deal with right now. She filed it. She was very good at filing things. You could have told me, she said instead. You would have tried to go anyway. There was no judgment in it. Only accuracy, which was worse. You would have said you could handle it. I could have. Briar. Just her name. Low and quiet. The way he said it when he needed her to stop performing composure and actually think. She stopped. The rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows in steady sheets, and the city below was blurred and glittering and very far away, and she was standing in Atlas Moreau's living room in a ruined silk dress with mascara she could feel drying on her cheekbones, and he was watching her with those dark, patient eyes that she had spent 3 years learning not to look at directly. The second closet, she said finally. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, she wasn't sure his face knew the architecture for softness, but a loosening, slight and brief, like a knot taken down 1 degree. Down the hall. First door on the left. She found it. The closet was organized with the same precision that governed every other aspect of his life, and the section he'd indicated held what appeared to be an assortment of unworn garments still in dry cleaning bags, neutral, expensive, women's sizes she didn't want to think too hard about. She pulled a gray cashmere set that looked like it had never been touched and told herself it didn't mean anything. She changed in the bathroom, which was predictably extraordinary and which she refused to be impressed by on principle. When she came back, he was standing at the window with his glass, looking out at the rain. He'd removed his tie. His collar was open 2 buttons and she could see the tattoo that climbed his throat, that dark geometric line she'd spent 3 years noticing in her peripheral vision and never, not once, looked at directly. She looked at it now. Just for a second. Just long enough to understand, in some wordless register below thought, that she was in trouble that had nothing to do with Saren's men outside her apartment. He didn't turn around. There's food if you want it, he said. And you're in the guest room. 3rd door. I know how to count doors, Mr. Moreau. You called me Mr. Moreau outside. Old habit. Professional habit. We're not in the office. She looked at his reflection in the rain-dark glass, the broad lines of him, the stillness, and felt the truth of that land somewhere it had no business landing. No, she said quietly. We're not. Neither of them said anything after that. The rain kept falling, punishing the city below, and Briar stood in borrowed cashmere in the lion's den and understood, with perfect terrible clarity, that nothing about tomorrow was going to look like anything she'd planned. She found the wound in the bathroom mirror. It wasn't dramatic, a shallow cut along her left side, just below the ribs, where she must have caught the edge of something during the chaos outside the club. A door handle, maybe, or the corner of a vehicle panel when Atlas's men had moved her with the specific urgency of people who don't explain themselves. She hadn't felt it happen. Adrenaline was efficient that way, borrowing pain from later, and later had apparently arrived. The cashmere had hidden it. The fabric was dark enough that she hadn't noticed the transfer until she'd peeled it away to assess, and now she stood in the marble bathroom looking at a 3-inch gash that had stopped bleeding and started again and was going to ruin the towel if she wasn't careful. She pressed a folded square of tissue to it and ran the math quietly. It wasn't deep enough to need stitches. It was absolutely deep enough to need something more than tissue and optimism. She thought about the first aid kit in her own apartment, the one she kept stocked precisely because working for Atlas Moreau meant existing in proximity to situations that occasionally required one, and felt the particular frustration of being well prepared somewhere she currently wasn't. She could manage this herself. She'd managed worse. She was still telling herself this when she opened the bathroom door and nearly walked into him. Atlas was in the hallway with the unhurried presence of a man who had simply been there, as though he materialized in spaces rather than moved through them. His gaze dropped to the tissue she was pressing to her side with one hand, and something behind his eyes went very still in a way she'd learned to recognize. Not alarm, exactly, but the thing that came just before it, the moment of calculation before the response. "When did that happen?" he said. "Not a question. It's fine. When did it happen, Briar?" She moved the tissue slightly to show him, which she'd intended as a demonstration that it was minor and he could stand down. The effect it produced was the opposite. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the main room without a word. She followed, because the alternative was standing alone in the hallway holding tissue to her ribcage, and she had some remaining dignity to protect. He returned from somewhere with a first aid kit that was, she noted with deep involuntary irritation, significantly better stocked than her own. He set it on the low table near the chess set and opened it with the same systematic efficiency he brought to everything, and then he looked at her and waited. "I can do it myself," she said. "You can't see the angle properly. I have a mirror. Sit down." It was the quietness of it that undid her, not a command dressed up as a command, just a fact stated plainly, the way he might say the meeting is at 9 or take the north exit. She sat. The leather of the couch was warm and the lamp beside it cast everything in that low amber light, and she was aware, with excruciating precision, of exactly how much space he took up when he crouched in front of her. He moved the cashmere aside without asking, which was entirely in character, and somehow still managed to dislodge something in her composure. His hands were careful, more careful than she'd expected from hands she'd watched do things that didn't invite the word careful. He cleaned the cut with antiseptic and she kept her face neutral and breathed slowly through the sting and looked at the rain on the window and nodded him. "Hold still," he said quietly. "I am holding still. You're bracing. Those are the same thing." He made a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a sound of amusement. She didn't look down to verify. He worked in silence after that, and the silence was different from the silence in the car. That one had been charged with what had happened outside the club, with the weight of his hand on her arm and the words that had followed. This one was something else. It had a texture to it, something close and careful, and she became aware in slow increments of things she had no practical use for, the warmth radiating off him, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows that she could see in her peripheral vision, the way his thumb pressed flat against her skin to hold the closure strip taut without pressing the wound itself. He was meticulous. She hadn't known that about him in this context. She had known it about his work, his contracts, his strategy, the way he ran operations with a precision that left no variable unaccounted for. She hadn't known it translated into this. Into the way he smoothed the edge of the bandage with one careful pass of his thumb, as though the finished result mattered, as though she mattered, in some register beyond the professional utility she'd always understood herself to occupy in his life. She made herself look at the chess game to avoid thinking about it. "You play black," she said. A pause. His hands didn't stop. "What?" "The chess set. You're playing black. Whoever plays white is losing." "I play both sides," he said. "When I can't sleep." She absorbed that. The image it produced, Atlas Moreau alone at 2 in the morning, moving pieces on behalf of both players, running the game against itself, was not the image of the man she thought she'd understood for 3 years. That man didn't have 2 in the morning. He didn't have insomnia or empty rooms or a half-finished game waiting for him on a low table in lamplight. "Who's winning?" she asked. "Black." "Do you always let black win?" He looked up then, and they were close in a way the logistics of the situation had made inevitable, her seated, him crouched, the lamp between them and the rain on the glass behind her, and his eyes in that light were not dark the way she'd always categorized them. They were the particular brown of deep water, of old wood, of things that had more complexity than their surface suggested. "Not always," he said. "Only when black deserves to." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't certain it was about chess. He dropped his G. The call came at 6:14 in the morning. Briar heard it through the wall, not the words, just the register of Atlas's voice shifting from the low, even cadence of sleep-adjacent quiet into something clipped and precise that she had learned, in 3 years, meant the perimeter of a situation had changed. She lay in the guest room with the gray cashmere pulled to her chin and the Chicago skyline bleeding pale light through curtains she hadn't closed, and she listened to the shape of the conversation without being able to hear its content, and she knew before he knocked on her door that whatever careful equilibrium the night had produced was over. He opened the door without waiting. She was already sitting up. He was dressed, dark trousers, a shirt not yet buttoned at the collar, and she registered in the peripheral way she'd become expert at that he looked like he hadn't slept, or had slept the way soldiers did, in shallow intervals designed for waking fast. He held his phone loosely at his side. His expression was the one she thought of as his operational face, not cold, exactly, but sealed. Every unnecessary thing locked behind it. "My team did a sweep of your building," he said. "Your apartment has been entered." She looked at him. "When?" "Sometime between 11 last night and 2 this morning. They bypassed your lock, professionally, no damage to the frame, which means this wasn't opportunistic." He paused. "They left the entry clean because they wanted you to come back. They wanted you inside before you knew anything was wrong." The information assembled itself in her mind with a clarity that was almost clinical. She thought about her door, which she'd deadbolt every night for 4 years out of a habit she developed long before she understood what working for Atlas Moreau would eventually require. She thought about her kitchen, her bedroom, the specific arrangement of her life in that apartment, the reading lamp she left on a timer, the second phone she kept in the hollowed-out dictionary on the third shelf, the emergency folder taped flat to the underside of the bathroom vanity. "The folder under the vanity," she said. Something moved in his expression. "My team retrieved it before anyone else found it. Along with the secondary phone." He held her gaze. "You kept an emergency exit package in your apartment." "I work for you," she said evenly. It seemed prudent. He looked at her for a long moment with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite approval but lived in the narrow territory between them. Then he set his phone on the dresser and crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe in a way that made him look, briefly, like something other than what he was. "Saren's family isn't making a play for territory," he said. "This is targeted. You, specifically." He said it without softening it, because that was the only way he knew how to deliver information that mattered. "They've identified you as a structural vulnerability." "A vulnerability," she repeated. "The word they'll have used is leverage." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It amounts to the same thing." Briar pulled the cashmere tighter and looked at the window and let the information finish landing. She had understood, in the abstract, what her proximity to the Moreau syndicate cost. She had done the calculation when she'd taken the job, had revised it periodically over 3 years as her access deepened and the nature of what she managed for him expanded beyond any reasonable definition of executive secretary. She had known that the Dunning file alone made her a target if it ever became known she held it. She had known that the things she had seen, organized, and in some cases quietly made disappear, gave her a profile that extended well beyond the boundaries of her job title. She had known all of this in the abstract. The abstract was gone now. In its place was a clean, cold concrete fact: her apartment was a trap, and she had no home to go back to, and the only reason she was sitting in this guest room instead of walking into something she would not have walked out of was that Atlas Moreau had put his hand on her arm in the rain and made a decision she hadn't been consulted about. She hated that. She was also, in some part of herself she wasn't ready to examine, deeply, quietly grateful for it, which she hated more. "My cat," she said suddenly. A beat. The first genuine pause she'd pulled from him all morning. "What?" "I have a cat. Mrs. Aldridge next door has a spare key and feeds her when I travel, but if your team went through the building," she stopped. "If Saren's people were watching the entrances, then Mrs. Aldridge is. I'll have someone check on her." He said it without hesitation, which was somehow the most disorienting thing he'd done since the night before. "The neighbor and the cat." She nodded once, precisely, and looked back at the window because looking at him right now required a composure she hadn't fully assembled yet. "My work files," she said, moving herself back onto solid ground by force of will. "Everything I keep locally at the apartment, the secondary drive, the physical correspondence from the Veltri account. Accounted for. My team photographed everything in situ before extracting what was critical." He paused. "You had it organized well. It made the sweep faster." "I always organize things well." "I know." It hung there between them, simple and without agenda, and that was somehow harder to absorb than any of the rest of it. She had spent 3 years being competent in his proximity and having that competence treated as the baseline minimum, as simply the condition of her continued employment. She had not spent 3 years being told, in that low certain voice, "I know," as though her capability was something he had noticed, specifically, and filed. She stood up. Her side pulled where the bandage held the cut closed, a tight reminder of the night before, and she moved to the window and looked down at the city coming awake in the gray morning light, rain still streaking the glass. From this height, Chicago looked like it belonged to someone. She knew who. "I need a toothbrush," she said. "And coffee. And then I need you to tell me everything you know about Saren's operation, because if they've made me a target then I am not sitting in this penthouse managing your calendar while you handle it." A pause behind her. "I have a full brief prepared," he said. "And there's coffee." "Of course there is." She turned from the window. He was watching her from the doorway with that sealed expression, but something in the set of it had shifted. Some increment of tension she hadn't realized he was carrying had moved, or loosened, or reorganized itself into something she didn't have a name for yet. "And Atlas." The name landed differently than it had last night. No Mr. Moreau, no professional buffer between them. His eyes registered it. "We're going to talk about the fact that you made this decision for me," she said. "The one where you put me in a car without explaining that my apartment was already being watched. We're going to have that conversation." He held her gaze. "I know. Not now. But we're going to have it." "I know," he said again, quieter, and she understood from the way he said it that he wasn't conceding the argument. He was simply acknowledging that she was owed it, and that he intended to be there when she collected. She walked past him into the hallway, and he didn't move from the doorframe to let her pass easily, which meant she had to turn slightly sideways, which meant for one breath she was closer to him than the space required. She kept walking. The city outside was gray and rain-washed and hers no longer in the way it had been yesterday morning, and somewhere below in the streets the Saren family was reorganizing around a plan that had failed, which meant they were already building the next one. She needed that coffee. She needed it before any of the rest of what today was going to require. The brief took 4 hours. Atlas laid it out on the dining table with the methodical precision of a man who had been building the picture longer than he was letting on. Satellite images of Saren's known properties, financial movement reports spanning 8 months, a network diagram of the family Chicago infrastructure that was too detailed to have been assembled after last night. Breyer sat across from him with her coffee gone cold beside her and worked through it page by page, and somewhere around the second hour she stopped pretending she was surprised by any of it and started asking the questions that actually mattered. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, the part where information stopped being data and started being architecture, where the pattern underneath became visible if you tilted your head at the right angle. It was why he'd hired her. It was why, 3 years later, she knew things about the Moreau syndicate that his own lieutenants didn't, because Atlas had learned early that the person who organized the information was the person who actually understood it, and understanding it made her dangerous in ways that were useful to him. She understood now that being useful to him had made her dangerous to everyone else. By noon they had a working theory. Saren wasn't moving on territory, he was moving on the Veltri account, specifically the refinancing structure Breyer had quietly engineered 8 months ago to clean a substantial portion of the syndicate's eastern holdings. She had built it to be invisible, and it had been, until someone inside the Moreau organization had told someone outside it where to look. A traitor. Someone close enough to know about the Veltri account, close enough to understand its function, close enough to identify Breyer as the architect. She noted Atlas's expression when they arrived at this conclusion and said nothing about what she saw there. That was a conversation for a different chapter of today. By evening they had moved from the dining table to the main room, and the organized precision of the morning brief had given way to the messier work of contingency. What if this? What if that? What if Saren moved before they could identify the source? She had her laptop open on the coffee table and 3 separate threads running, and Atlas was on the phone intermittently with people she recognized by the way he changed register for each of them, and outside the window Chicago had gone from gray afternoon to the specific blue-black of a winter evening, and neither of them had eaten anything since the toast she'd made at 10. It was past midnight when it finally broke open. She had been cross-referencing visitor logs from the Moreau building against the timeline of the Veltri communications leak, and she'd found something, a small misalignment, a name present in one log that shouldn't have been, a window of access that was 8 minutes longer than it needed to be, and she had flagged it and moved on, because flagging things and moving on was what she did, and she had compiled it into the document she was building for Atlas to review. What she had not done was mention that the same name appeared in Saren's network diagram. On the outer edge, peripheral, easy to miss. She had noted it and decided to verify before raising it, because raising it without verification was the kind of thing that moved too fast and broke things that couldn't be unbroken. Atlas saw it anyway. He leaned over to look at something on her screen and went very still in the way that meant he'd seen something she hadn't drawn his attention to, and then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "You found this earlier," he said. "An hour ago." "I'm still verifying." "An hour ago." He straightened. "And you didn't say anything." "I just said, I'm verifying. I don't raise unconfirmed." "An hour ago, Breyer." His voice had shifted into something lower, and she recognized it as the register he used when he was keeping something tight. "While I was on the phone with Reyes, running contingencies that would have changed entirely if I'd had this information." She closed her laptop. "The contingencies don't change until the name is confirmed. Raising it before that creates. I decide what changes and what doesn't. That's not your call." There it was. She'd been waiting for it, she realized, had felt it pressurizing under the surface of the day's careful professionalism, this specific shape of his control, the way it expanded in a crisis to fill every available space including the ones that belonged to her. "With respect," she said, and her voice came out quiet and precise and not particularly respectful in its temperature, "my judgment about what information is ready to present is absolutely my call. That's the entire function I serve. The function you serve is to keep me informed." "The function I serve," she said, standing, because this conversation required her to be standing, "is to manage information with enough intelligence that you're not chasing ghosts every time someone preliminary shows up in a log. I've spent 3 years making sure that every piece of intelligence you receive from me is verified because that's what makes it worth anything. I'm not changing that methodology because you're, she paused, choosing the word carefully, unsettled. His jaw tightened. Unsettled. You brought me here without telling me my apartment was already being watched. You made a unilateral decision about my safety and my location and my life, and I accepted that because the situation warranted it, but I will not also surrender my professional judgment to your need to have every variable in your hands the moment it exists. Those are two different things. They become the same thing when your life is the variable. The sentence landed differently than she expected. Not hard, not sharp, almost quiet, and that quietness was what stopped her. I'm trying to keep you alive, he said, and there was nothing performative in it, no armor, just the plain difficult fact of it standing in the room between them. That requires me to have information as it exists, not as it's been curated. And I'm trying to be useful to you in the way I actually know how to be, she said, and her voice had lost some of its edge because his had lost all of his, and this was more dangerous than the argument, which means I cannot become someone who runs to you with every half-formed fragment because you're anxious about what I might be sitting on. That's not a partnership. That's a surveillance arrangement. The word partnership moved through the air between them and she felt him feel it. Is that what you want? He said, after a moment. A partnership. She met his eyes and held them and thought about the right answer, and the honest answer, and whether in this particular moment those were the same. I want you to trust my judgment, she said finally. The same way I've spent 3 years trusting yours. He looked at her for a long time. The city hummed 30 floors below them, and the chess set sat between them on the low table, black still winning its patient game, and she could see him working through something, not the information, not the strategy, something underneath both of those things, something he didn't have a protocol for. The name, he said at last. Tell me what you have. Not a concession. Not exactly. But a door, opening the width of 1 careful inch, and she understood instinctively that with Atlas Moreau that was how it would always begin, not with surrender but with a question, not with yielding but with choosing to let someone else hold something he'd been carrying alone. She opened her laptop. Sit down, she said quietly. It's going to take a minute to walk you through it properly. He sat. And she began. The invitation had been on Atlas's calendar for 6 weeks. The Hargrove Foundation Gala, annual, black tie, the kind of event that existed in the precise overlap between legitimate Chicago society and the darker architecture that funded half of it. Breyer had confirmed his attendance herself in October, had coordinated with the foundation's event director, had arranged his table placement with the careful political geometry that these things required. She had done all of this in her capacity as his executive secretary, and she had not, at any point in that process, imagined attending it herself. Atlas told her the plan over breakfast. He laid it out with the same flat efficiency he'd used for the brief, as though the variables were equivalent: Saren's network diagram, the Veltri leak, and now Breyer in a gown at a fundraiser, none of it categorically different, all of it simply the next necessary move on the board. The traitor was someone in his inner circle. Someone who would be at the Hargrove Gala because everyone in his inner circle would be at the Hargrove Gala. If Breyer appeared on his arm, not as staff, not as the efficient invisible woman who managed his schedule from a respectful distance, but as something else entirely, something that implied access of a different kind, it would create pressure. The traitor would need to communicate the development to Saren. That communication would create a signal. The signal would give them a name. You want to use me as bait, she said. I want to use the situation as bait. You're the one who changes the situation. That's a very precise distinction. Most useful ones are. She looked at him across the breakfast table in the gray morning light and thought about all the ways this could go wrong and said nothing about any of them, because he had clearly already thought about all of them too and had decided the risk calculus worked, and she had spent 4 days now learning that arguing with his risk calculus required more than objection, it required a better number. She didn't have a better number. I'll need a dress, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure his mouth had the full vocabulary for smiling, but its grammatical relative, the punctuation just before 1. Already arranged. Of course it was. The dress was deep emerald, structured at the bodice and fluid everywhere below it, the kind of garment that had opinions about posture. It arrived that afternoon in a black box with no receipt and no store name, which told her everything about how it had been acquired and nothing about how he'd known her size, which she decided not to examine. There were shoes. There were also, in a smaller box beneath the tissue paper, a pair of earrings, dark stones she couldn't immediately identify, set simply in gold, the kind of jewelry that didn't announce itself but changed everything in a room when the light hit it correctly. She held one earring up in the bathroom light and looked at her reflection and thought, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had not chosen these by delegating. She put them on anyway. The car collected them at 8. Atlas in black tie was a recalibration she managed by simply not looking at him directly for the first several minutes, which was a strategy that had served her well for 3 years and which collapsed entirely when he held his hand out to help her into the car and she had to take it. His grip was brief and certain and he released her hand the moment she was seated, but the warmth of it stayed in her palm for the length of the drive and she kept her eyes on the window and her expression professionally neutral and told herself this was a role, a function, a tactical deployment of social performance, the same as every other thing she'd done this week. The gala was held in a building on Michigan Avenue that managed to make its own grandeur look effortless, high vaulted ceilings, candlelight doing things to the air that electric light couldn't, the muted roar of 300 people performing versions of themselves for one another. Breyer had attended events like this before, peripherally, in the background capacity of someone making sure the right cars arrived at the right times. She had never walked into one at Atlas Moreau's side, his hand at the small of her back, her name introduced to people she'd only ever seen in financial documents and surveillance photographs as though she were simply someone he'd brought, which of course she was, except that nothing about this week had been simple. She felt the room notice him. She had seen this before in smaller contexts, the way attention organized itself around him without appearing to, the way conversations in his vicinity shifted register, but at scale, in a room full of people whose business it was to identify and respond to power, it was something else entirely. It was tidal. And because she was beside him, close enough that his arm occasionally brushed hers as he turned, some fraction of that tide moved around her too, and she watched people's eyes adjust when they were introduced, recalibrate, file her in a new category than the one she'd occupied yesterday. She worked the room the way she worked everything, methodically, with enough warmth to be disarming and enough precision to miss nothing. She was looking for behavior, not faces. The way someone's attention snagged on her and then moved too quickly away. The person who took out their phone at the wrong moment. The micro-expression of someone absorbing information they hadn't expected and needed to transmit. She found 3 candidates in the first hour. She narrowed it to 1 by the second. She didn't tell Atlas directly. She found a moment when they were standing together at the edge of the room with champagne neither of them was drinking, and she leaned close enough that her words wouldn't carry and said quietly, "Northeast corner. Gray suit. He's looked at his phone 4 times since we arrived and each time was within 90 seconds of us speaking to someone new." Atlas didn't look. He was very good at not looking. "I see him. He came in with Castellan's group but he's not talking to Castellan." "No," Atlas said. "He's not." And something in the way he said it told her that this was not new information to him, that this name was not a surprise, and that whatever she'd seen move across his face in the penthouse when they'd arrived at the conclusion of a traitor was about to resolve into something specific and painful. She wanted to ask. She kept it behind her teeth. "Dance with me," he said instead. She turned to look at him. He was already offering his hand, the same way he'd helped her into the car, certain, brief, leaving the choice to her while making the logic of the choice undeniable. "That's not necessary for the operation," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face, which was giving her very little and somehow giving her everything, and she thought about 3 years of professional distance and the week that had happened to both of them and the earrings she was wearing that he had not chosen by delegating. She took his hand. The floor was polished dark wood and the orchestra was playing something that didn't require counting, and he held her correctly, not close enough to be inappropriate and not far enough to be performance, and she was aware of every point of contact with the focused attention of someone trying very hard not to be aware of any of them. His name, she said quietly, because she needed to be talking about something, is Reyes, isn't it? His hand at her back tightened, once, by a degree she might have missed if she hadn't been cataloging everything. Yes, he said. She absorbed that. Reyes, who she had heard Atlas call twice from the dining table during the brief, whose voice she'd recognized in the background of 3 years of operational calls, whose name appeared in the outer edge of Saren's network diagram where she hadn't wanted it to be. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it without qualification. He looked at her, and the title room moved around them, and his expression did the thing it had been doing all week, not opening, exactly, but thinning, the way ice thins over water when something warmer moves beneath it. Keep dancing, he said quietly. He's still watching. She kept dancing. So did he. And the orchestra played on, and Reyes watched from the northeast corner with his phone in his hand, and Breyer thought that this was the moment. Not the rain outside the club, not the bandage in the lamplight, not the argument at midnight. This was the moment things became irreversible. His hand warmed through the emerald fabric at the small of her back, the city glittering beyond the tall windows, both of them pretending to be something they weren't and somehow, in the pretending, becoming it. Anyway. The breach came 17 minutes after she'd stopped counting. She knew the exact moment it happened because Atlas's hand flattened against her back. Not tightening, not pulling, just a single change in pressure that she had learned in the last 5 days to read the way she read everything else about him, which was to say immediately and completely. His eyes moved over her shoulder in the direction of the main entrance, and whatever he saw there did something to his expression that she felt rather than observed, a change in the atmosphere of him, the way barometric pressure changes before weather arrives. Don't look, he said, very quietly, in a voice calibrated for her ears and no further. Walk with me. She walked with him. They moved off the dance floor with the unhurried ease of two people simply relocating, which was the performance of it. Atlas Moreau did not hurry, and anyone watching would read their pace as choice rather than necessity, would see a man and a woman drifting toward the edge of the room with the specific gravity of people who had somewhere more interesting to be. She caught it in her peripheral vision as they moved. 2 men at the entrance who had not been there 20 minutes ago, dressed correctly for the evening but standing incorrectly for it, too still, too attentive, their eyes moving in the pattern of men counting exits rather than admiring the room. Behind them, the Foundation's security staff were engaged in a conversation that had the body language of people being firmly redirected. Saren's men. Here, inside, which meant someone had either provided credentials or the credentials had been taken from someone who could no longer object to their use. Reyes, she said, barely a sound. Yes, Atlas said, the same way he'd said it on the dance floor, clipped and final, confirmation without elaboration because elaboration was for later and later required surviving now. His hand moved from her back to her wrist, not gripping, just present, directional, and they turned down a service corridor she hadn't known was there, which meant he had walked this building before tonight and noted it, which meant this contingency was not entirely a surprise to him, which she filed for the argument they would have later about the precise definition of keeping her informed. The corridor was narrow and service-lit, fluorescent and unglamorous against the candlelit grandeur 30 feet behind them. They passed a catering station and a linen trolley and a fire door Atlas tested and dismissed in one motion, and then they were at the end of the corridor where it branched, and his phone was in his hand and he was reading something with an expression that told her the information was not good. North exit is covered, he said. Kellerman is rerouting the car but it needs 8 minutes. We don't have 8 minutes. No. She looked at the door to her left. A panel beside it read archive in the utilitarian font of rooms that existed to be functional and nothing else. She tried the handle. It opened. Here, she said. He looked at her, looked at the door, made the calculation in the way he made all calculations, fast, total, and without visible deliberation, and they went through it. The archive room was not built for 2 people to be comfortable. It was built for filing boxes and flat storage drawers and the kind of institutional shelving that maximized capacity over any consideration of human proportion. There was a single work light on a motion sensor that activated when they entered and then dimmed, after 30 seconds of stillness, to almost nothing. Almost nothing was enough to see by, barely, the shelf edges, the geometry of the boxes, and him, close in the way the room made inevitable. She could hear the muffled sounds of the gala continuing beyond several walls, the orchestra unaware, the city of performing people performing on. Closer, she could hear him breathing, and her own pulse, and the specific quality of a small room holding two people who are trying to take up less space than they occupy. She had her back to a shelving unit. He was facing the door, one hand braced against the shelf above her head, not caging her, just positioned, between her and whatever came through that door if something came through it. It was a tactical posture. She understood it as a tactical posture. Her understanding of it as a tactical posture did not prevent her from being acutely aware of the warmth of him in the ambient dark, the cedarwood and something warmer underneath it, the way the dim light caught the line of his jaw and the geometry of the ink at his collar. His phone screen was off. No light, no signal, nothing to give their position. They were simply waiting. She had been very good at waiting her entire professional life. She discovered now that this particular variety of waiting was different. "How long have you known about Reyes?" she said, in the quiet voice the room required. A pause. 3 weeks. She absorbed that. "You were building a case." "I was building certainty." "There's a difference." "There's a difference," she agreed, "and there's also the fact that you sent me to coordinate with him twice in the last month, which means you used me in an operation I didn't know I was part of." She felt more than heard the breath he drew. "Yes. That's the conversation we're going to have after this." "I know. I want you to know that I know it's going to be a significant conversation." Briar. Her name in the dark, quiet and close. "I know." She stopped talking because there was a sound in the corridor, footsteps, 2 sets, unhurried, the particular tread of men who were searching rather than moving towards something specific. They both went absolutely still in the way that isn't decided but simply happens, the body making the call before the mind catches up, and she was aware in the stillness of his hand gripping the shelf above her head and the slight forward shift of his weight that put more of him between her and the door, and the fact that she trusted this, the fact that her body trusted it completely and without consultation. The footsteps passed. Slowed. Continued. Faded. Neither of them moved for another 30 seconds, which she counted by pulse rather than clock. When she exhaled, it came out unsteady, and she hated it, hated the involuntary evidence of adrenaline, the way her body broadcast things her face had been trained not to show. She felt him register it. The shelf above her head shifted fractionally as his grip adjusted. "It's done," he said, very quietly. "They've passed." "I know." Her voice was almost steady. Almost. He looked down at her in the near dark and she looked up at him, and the distance between them was what the room had made it, the physics of 2 people in a small space, nothing decided, nothing intended, and yet in the dim work light his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was working through something he didn't have a protocol for, that quality of attention she'd first noticed in the guest room doorway, focused and unguarded and directed entirely at her. She became aware, in a slow and irreversible way, that he was going to kiss her. That it had already been decided somewhere before either of them understood it was under consideration. The awareness was calm, which surprised her. She had imagined, in the abstract versions of this she had not permitted herself, that it would arrive with alarm, with the professional panic of someone watching a line approach and not being able to stop moving toward it. Instead it arrived like recognition. He moved slowly enough that she could have stopped it. She understood that was deliberate, that this man who made unilateral decisions about her location and her safety and her participation in operations she hadn't consented to was, in this, giving her the architecture of a choice. Leaving enough space between the intention and the arrival for her to step back if stepping back was what she wanted. She didn't step back. His mouth was warm and certain and unhurried, which was exactly how she should have known it would be, the same quality of attention he brought to everything, nothing wasted, nothing performative, the specific pressure of someone who had thought about this and was in no hurry to finish thinking. Her hand found the lapel of his jacket without her deciding it should, and she felt his exhale against her lips, quiet and unguarded, the sound of something long held finally set down. He pulled back slowly. Not far. An inch, perhaps two, enough to look at her in the low light. She was still holding his lapel. She released it carefully and smoothed the fabric, which was unnecessary and bought her 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds she assembled enough of herself to meet his eyes without performing the meeting. "Your phone," she said. He looked at her for another moment, reading her, the way he read everything, not intrusively but completely, and then he looked at his phone. "Cars outside," he said. "Kellerman has the north side clear. Then we should go." "Yes." Neither of them moved for one more breath. The archive room held them in its dim stillness, the gala murmuring beyond the walls, the city indifferent beyond the building, and something that had been approaching for 5 days and 3 years settled quietly into the space between them like a key finding the right lock. Then they moved. And the room let them go. She didn't sleep on the drive back. Atlas sat beside her in the dark interior of the Escalade with his phone in his hand and his operational face fully restored, working through whatever the next 12 hours required with the focused efficiency of someone who had compartmentalized the archive room so completely it might not have happened. She watched the city move past the tinted windows and let him work and did not examine the fact that she could still feel the precise weight of his mouth against hers if she allowed herself to, which she didn't, because the car was full of men and the night was full of consequences and there was something sitting at the edge of her mind that she had been not looking at since the dance floor. Reyes. Not Reyes, the name on the outer edge of Saren's diagram. Not Reyes, the man with the phone in the northeast corner who had looked at them 4 times in the first hour. Something else. Something she had flagged and moved past in the velocity of the evening and that was now returning with the patient insistence of information that knows it matters. She opened the document on her phone, the one she'd been building since the second morning, the running record of cross-references and timeline misalignments and the careful accumulation of things that didn't quite fit. She scrolled without appearing to scroll, her expression giving nothing, the screen angled so that the light didn't carry. She found it at the bottom of page 4. She had noted it 6 days ago and categorized it as a secondary flag, something to return to once the primary identification was confirmed. A communication thread routed through a relay server in Antwerp, standard enough for the syndicate's encrypted correspondence, nothing notable about the routing itself. What was notable, what she had flagged and then buried in the velocity of everything else, was the authorization signature used to access the relay. The signature belonged to Reyes. She had always known that. What she had not cross-referenced until this moment, sitting in the back of an Escalade with rain on the windows and Atlas 3 feet away, was the date the relay account had been created. 14 months ago. 14 months ago, Reyes had created an encrypted relay account through a server in Antwerp. The Veltri account, the one being used to leverage Breyer as a target, had been structured 11 months ago. The architecture of the leak wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't Reyes identifying a vulnerability and reporting it to Saren in the weeks after it was created. Reyes had built the relay before the Veltri account existed. Which meant he hadn't leaked information about the Veltri structure. He had been inside the Saren network when the Veltri structure was being designed. He had shaped it, from the inside, to be leakable. He had built the vulnerability into the account at the point of its creation and then waited 14 months for the right moment to use it. This was not a betrayal of opportunity. This was a betrayal of architecture. Patient, deliberate, constructed over more than a year inside the closest ring of Atlas Moreau's trust. She looked at the date again. 14 months ago. She ran the calendar backward without appearing to do anything at all. 14 months ago, Atlas had promoted Reyes from regional to inner circle. She had processed the paperwork herself. She had updated the security clearances, the communication authorizations, the access credentials that came with moving from the outer structure to the center of it. She had given Reyes the tools for this. Not knowing, not complicit, simply doing her job with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and in doing it she had handed a man already working for Saren the keys to the relay server he'd needed to make the whole architecture function. She put her phone face down on her knee and looked at the window and breathed. This was the conversation she didn't know how to have. Not because of the information itself, she had delivered difficult intelligence to Atlas before, had sat across from him in operational contexts and laid out conclusions he hadn't wanted to reach, and he had always received those with the same sealed efficiency, absorbing and proceeding. She knew how to deliver a finding. She knew how to frame evidence, walk through a timeline, present a conclusion with the supporting structure visible. What she didn't know how to do was deliver this specific finding to this specific man in the hours after what had happened in an archive room, when the professional distance that had always been the medium through which she transmitted difficult things had been altered in a way that changed the acoustics of everything. Because this wasn't just about Reyes. This was about the fact that Atlas had trusted Reyes implicitly, had promoted him, had relied on him, had called him twice from the dining table while building the brief, had used his analysis to shape contingencies. And this was about the fact that the trust had been manufactured. That Reyes had performed loyalty for 14 months with enough precision and consistency to deceive a man who was not deceived easily. That somewhere in Atlas's interior, in whatever locked and carefully maintained space he kept the things he chose to depend on, Reyes had been real. She knew what it cost Atlas to let things be real. She had spent 5 days understanding the specific architecture of that cost in ways she hadn't in 3 years of professional proximity. She picked her phone back up and read through the timeline once more, looking for the error she hoped to find. She didn't find it. The Antwerp relay account predated the Veltri structure by 3 months and the access pattern was consistent and the signature was clean and there was no version of this where the conclusion was different. She had to tell him. The only question was how. She thought about waiting until they were back at the penthouse, until he had set down the operational weight of the evening and they had returned to the dining table and the working structure of information shared across a professional distance. She could present it as she would present anything, methodically, with the supporting documentation visible, the timeline laid out so the conclusion arrived at the end rather than the beginning, earned rather than announced. She thought about what he had said in the car after the club. I knew it before I put my hand on your arm. The way he'd absorbed the information about her apartment, not reacting, already having processed the thing she was only just learning. The way he'd told her about Reyes on the dance floor, yes, single syllable, the weight of 3 weeks behind it. He had carried Reyes for 3 weeks. He had known the shape of this betrayal, or believed he had, and had carried it alone in the way he carried everything, sealed and functional and without the relief of telling someone. He had not known about the Antwerp relay. She was certain of that. What he'd known was a surface reading, Reyes's communications with Saren, the signal of tonight's breach. He did not know yet that this was 14 months deep. That it had been designed, not discovered. That the inner circle promotion had been the mechanism rather than the opportunity. She looked at him. He was reading something on his phone, his profile in the passing light of the expressway, jaw set, the collar still open from the gala, the ink of the tattoo visible at his throat. He looked like a man who had already absorbed a significant blow and was operating through it on the discipline of someone who had no other option. She thought about the chess game. Black playing both sides at 2 in the morning, alone in the amber light. The particular exhaustion of a man who had learned not to trust the weight of anything. She didn't wait for the penthouse. Atlas. His name in the dark, quiet and direct. He looked up from his phone. His eyes adjusted to her, reading the register of her expression with the speed he read everything, and she watched him understand in the half-second before she spoke that whatever she was about to say was going to require him to put something down that he wouldn't be able to pick back up. I found something tonight, she said. In the Antwerp relay logs. The account Reyes used, I have the creation date. He was very still. It predates the Veltri structure by 3 months, she said. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his and gave him the information the way she would want to receive it herself, plainly, without insulation, with enough respect for his capacity to absorb it that she didn't soften it into something easier but smaller. He was inside Saren's network before we built the account. The vulnerability in the Veltri structure wasn't leaked, Atlas. It was designed. He built it in from the beginning. The city moved past the windows. One of his men shifted in the front seat and went still again. The rain had stopped without her noticing and the expressway was wet and reflective and quiet. Atlas looked at her for a long time. 14 months, he said. Yes. Another silence. She waited in it without filling it, because some silences were not empty and this one was full of something she didn't have the right to move through faster than he did. He was in the room, Atlas said, very quietly, when I decided to promote him. When I told him I was bringing him into the inner circle. He paused. He shook my hand. She held his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that, no reframe, no operational pivot, no version of "we'll handle it" that touched the actual thing being described. She simply stayed present in the specific awfulness of it, which was all she had and which she understood, in this moment, was also exactly enough. She reached across the seat and put her hand over his. He looked down at it. He didn't move. Then his hand turned beneath hers, slowly, and his fingers closed around hers in the dark, not tightly, just present, the same quality of grip she'd felt when they danced, certain and brief and leaving the choice to her, except this time neither of them was pretending it was something else. Tell me the rest, he said quietly. All of it. So she did. And he listened, and the city moved past them, and his hand stayed around hers all the way home. The alarm came at 3:47 in the morning. Not a sound, a vibration, precise and sequenced, the kind of signal Atlas's security system produced when it was communicating something it didn't want broadcast to whatever might be listening. Briar felt it through the mattress of the guest room before she was fully awake, 3 short pulses then 2, and she was sitting up before she'd consciously identified what had pulled her from sleep, some calibration she developed over 5 days in this building, reading its rhythms the way she'd learned to read everything else about Atlas Moreau's world. She was dressed in 40 seconds. She didn't know when she'd started keeping her clothes where she could find them in the dark, only that she had, the same way she'd started sleeping lighter and noting exits and keeping her secondary phone charged to full. Adaptation happened below the level of decision when the environment required it. She had simply required it. Atlas was already in the main room when she came through the hallway. He was in dark clothes, operational in a way she'd never seen him, not the bespoke precision of his professional armor but something stripped and functional, and there was a weapon on the table beside his phone that she noted and did not react to because reacting to it was not useful. He was on comms, an earpiece she'd never seen him wear, and he was moving through the penthouse with the contained efficiency of a man executing a plan he'd already run in his head 100 times. He looked at her when she came in. Took in the fact that she was dressed, shoes on, secondary phone in hand, and something in his expression acknowledged this without making it a moment. East Perimeter, he said, to her or his earpiece or both. 3 vehicles, 9 confirmed, possibly 12. They cut the building's external feeds 20 seconds ago, which means they'd been on site longer than that. The Dunning file, she said immediately. Physical copies. Safe room. Already secured. He crossed to the table and picked up the weapon and checked it with the automatic motion of someone for whom this was as ordinary as checking a phone. The safe room is off the secondary hallway. Code is. I'm not going to the safe room. He looked at her. It was the look she'd been expecting since the moment she'd come into the hallway, the one that preceded the argument about her safety versus her operational value, the one that treated those two things as a binary when they had never been a binary. Briar. I have the Dunning file contents, she said. All of it. The Antwerp relay logs, the Veltri documentation, the 14-month timeline. I've had it structured and cross-referenced since yesterday morning and it lives in my head as much as it lives in the safe room. If something goes wrong with the physical copies, I'm the redundancy. She held his gaze. You don't put your redundancy in a separate room and hope for the best. A beat. 2. The earpiece said something she couldn't hear and he processed it without looking away from her. Stay on my left, he said. Do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. If I say down, you're already down. Understood. And take this. He produced a second weapon from somewhere she didn't track, smaller, already checked, and held it out to her. She took it with the steadiness of someone who had spent a year at a private range in the first months of this job because she had assessed the position and decided that competence in all relevant areas was non-negotiable. He watched her check it. Said nothing. Turned to the window. They came through the east service entrance at 4:02. Atlas's team held the lobby, but the east corridor was the soft point, a maintenance access route that predated the building's security renovations and had been on the remediation list for 6 months. She knew this because she had typed the remediation list. She knew exactly how long 6 months was. What followed was not cinematic. It was close and loud and very fast, and the penthouse's geography, the corridors she'd navigated for a week, the sight lines she'd absorbed without intending to, the distances between rooms she'd measured in the ordinary motion of living in a space, became functional information in a way she hadn't anticipated but didn't find surprising. Environments were just architecture. Architecture was just data. Atlas moved through his own space like a man who had mapped it for this purpose because he had, every room a set of contingencies, and she stayed on his left and matched his pace and did not require managing, which she understood from the set of his shoulders he was registering with something adjacent to relief. They held the main corridor for 11 minutes that felt like 11 separate decisions, each one requiring its own small act of precision. His team cleared the east wing. A second breach at the north stairwell was contained. She tracked the comms through his earpiece when he held position close enough for her to hear, the shorthand of men who'd done this before, efficient and bleak and without drama. Reyes had given Saren the building schematics. She knew this without being told, could see it in the precision of the breach points, the specific targeting of the security system's blind spots. 14 months of access, and Reyes had apparently spent some of that time walking these corridors with the patient attention of a man committing a building to memory. She thought about this instead of other things. The moment that shifted it came in the secondary hallway outside the safe room, which was where 2 of Saren's men had been told, incorrectly, that Atlas would be. They had been told this by Atlas's people, deliberately, which meant the secondary hallway was a controlled position and Atlas had walked them toward it with the calm of someone who had already seen this particular move played out to its conclusion. She understood in real time that the plan she'd been operating inside had more architecture than she'd been shown. She filed this also. What she hadn't planned for, what Atlas, she believed, had also not planned for, was the third man, coming from the service door at the hallway's end, not listed in the confirmed count, a variable that existed because 12-9 left 3 and 3-2 left 1 and 1 was currently between her and the 12 feet of distance that separated her from where Atlas was handling the other 2. She didn't think about it. The room didn't allow time for thinking about it. She moved with the clean instinct of a body that had made its decision below the level of deliberation, and she used the wall and the angle and the 3-inch advantage of surprise that came from being the person in the room nobody had been briefed to account for, and then it was over and she was breathing harder than she'd like and the secondary hallway was quiet. Atlas was beside her in 4 steps. His hand came to her face, both sides, tilting it up, his eyes moving across her with the rapid thoroughness of a man conducting an inventory of something he cannot afford to lose. "I'm fine," she said. His hands didn't move. He was still looking at her, that sealed expression fractured along one fault line, something unmanaged moving behind his eyes that he wasn't bothering to contain. "Atlas." Her voice was steady. Steadier than she felt. "I'm fine." He exhaled. Slow, controlled, the breath of a man reacquiring something he briefly believed was gone. His thumbs moved, once, against her cheekbones, not wiping anything away, just present, just the specific reassurance of contact. Then his earpiece spoke and he was operational again, the fracture closed, the sealed efficiency restored, and he dropped his hands and turned to the corridor and she followed, and the building held, and the next 40 minutes were the systematic work of finishing what had been started. It ended at 5:23 in the morning. The all-clear came through the comms in the flat tone of men reporting a completed task, and the penthouse settled into the specific silence of a space that had been through something and was now simply a space again. Atlas stood at the window where he'd stood that first night, and she stood behind him, and the city below was beginning to go pale at the edges with the particular gray of very early morning. She was aware of a tremor starting in her hands that she hadn't permitted during and was now apparently no longer able to defer. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. "Reyes," Atlas said, to the window. "My team has him." "Good," she said. "It's over." She thought about 14 months and a relay server in Antwerp and a handshake in a room where trust had been performed with such precision that it had been indistinguishable from the real thing. She thought about the chess game, black playing both sides, knowing every move before it happened. "The Veltri account," she said. "I can rebuild the structure cleanly. 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if we start tomorrow." He turned from the window. He looked at her the way he had in the secondary hallway, not the operational assessment, something prior to that, something that had no tactical function. "Tomorrow," he said. "Yes. Not tonight." She looked at her hands, which had almost stopped shaking. "Not tonight." He crossed the room toward her and she stayed where she was and let him arrive, and when he did he simply stood close in the way the archive room had made possible and the penthouse hallways had confirmed and the back seat of an Escalade had made inevitable, close enough that the cedarwood and warmth of him was present without being overwhelming, a radius she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "You didn't go to the safe room," he said. "No. I knew you wouldn't." She looked up at him. "Then why did you suggest it?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Because I needed to know if you'd argue." "And?" "You argued well," he said quietly. "You always do." The city went pale outside the windows, and the penthouse was quiet, and Briar stood in the early morning with the long night finally behind her and looked at Atlas Moreau and understood that the siege was over and something else was just beginning, and that she was, against all professional judgment and prior intention, completely unprepared to mind. The smoke from the final confrontation still clung to the rafters of the Moreau estate, a bitter incense of gunpowder and ozone that refused to dissipate even as the first gray light of dawn broke over the Chicago skyline. Atlas Moreau stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his silhouette etched against the waking city. His bespoke suit jacket was gone, his white shirt stained with the dark grit of the night's violence and unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the geometric ink climbing his throat. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like the ancient power his name suggested, a man who had held up the sky while the world tried to burn beneath him. Briar Vance sat in the heavy leather chair behind his desk, the very seat of his power. Her dark hair was a wild tangle, and a thin trail of dried blood marked the line of her cheekbone where a shard of glass had grazed her during the siege. She was exhausted, her fingers trembling slightly as she closed the laptop containing the final, decrypted remnants of the Dunning file. The traitor was gone, the rival families had been silenced, and the ledger was finally balanced. "It's done, Atlas," she said, her voice raspy and stripped of its usual professional sheen. "The digital footprint of the Moreau syndicate is clean. Every asset is shielded. Every loose end is tied." Atlas didn't turn immediately. He watched a single black sedan crawl along the distant street below, a predator returning to its den. "The price of a clean ledger is usually blood, Briar. You've spilled enough of yours tonight for a throne you don't even claim." "I was doing my job," she countered, though the lie felt thin and brittle in the quiet of the room. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and moved toward him. She stopped just outside his reach, wary of the heavy, magnetic pull he always exerted. "But the crisis is over. You don't need a fixer anymore. You need a vacation." Finally, he turned. The predatory darkness in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, focusing on her with a terrifying, singular intensity. He stepped into her space, his shadow swallowing her just as it had that rainy night outside the club. The scent of rain-dampened cedarwood and the metallic tang of the night's work filled her senses. "I don't want a fixer, Briar. And I don't want a secretary who keeps one foot out the door," he rasped, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that was more frightening than his rage. His thumb traced the small cut on her cheek. "For 3 years, I've watched you navigate my world with that razor-sharp mind of yours. I've watched you protect me from enemies I didn't see and messes I didn't care to clean. I thought I could own you with a salary and a contract. I was a fool." Briar's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she could no longer suppress. "Atlas. Be quiet," he commanded, though there was no bite in it, only a desperate, raw honesty. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a small, velvet box. He didn't kneel. Atlas Moreau was not a man who bowed, but the way he held the box out felt like an offering of his entire empire. He flipped it open. A diamond, cut with the same relentless precision as his business deals, caught the dawn light and shattered it into 1,000 sharp fragments. It wasn't a dainty piece of jewelry, it was a statement of intent, heavy, brilliant, and unbreakable. "Your old contract is void," Atlas said, his gaze locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "I'm offering you a new one. No more glass walls between our offices. No more, Mr. Moreau, in public and silence in private. I don't want you behind me, and I certainly don't want you under me. I want you beside me." Briar looked from the ring to the man who stood before her, a king who had realized his kingdom was hollow without the person who kept it standing. She thought of the thorns she had navigated and the cold steel she had become to survive him. "A shared throne is a dangerous place to sit, Atlas," she whispered, her hand rising to rest over his heart. She could feel the steady, powerful throb of it, a counterpoint to her own frantic pulse. "The world will never stop trying to tear us down." Atlas covered her hand with his own, pressing it harder against his chest. A ghost of a smile, sharp, dangerous, and devastatingly beautiful, touched his lips. "Let them try," he said, his voice dropping to a possessive growl as he leaned down, his breath warm against her lips. "I am Atlas. I can hold up the sky. But I'm done holding it up alone. Sign the contract, Briar. Tell me you're never going home to that empty apartment again." Briar didn't need the Dunning file to calculate the risks of this deal. She knew the cost of loving a man like Atlas Moreau was total, but as she looked into his dark, hungry eyes, she realized she had stopped being a spectator in his war a long time ago. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, perfect surface of the ring before she slid her hand into his. "The terms are acceptable, Atlas," she murmured, just before he closed the distance between them, sealing the new empire with a kiss that tasted of victory and the promise of a beautiful, velvet-lined cage. The rain began to fall again over Chicago, slicking the streets and washing away the blood of the night before. But inside the Moreau estate, the glass walls had finally shattered, and for the first time in his life, the man who held up the world felt light. He had his razor, and she had her titan. Together, they weren't just a syndicate, they were a storm. And just like that, the contract is signed. The throne is shared. The predator has finally found his equal. But every empire has a beginning, and every king has a secret. Atlas and Briar's story is only just beginning to show its teeth. If this world pulled you in, if you felt the heat of that final kiss and the weight of everything they risked, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that stories this intense deserve to be seen. Subscribe to the family, because this is just one door in a fortress full of them, and what's waiting behind the next one will keep you up long past midnight. Drop a comment below. Were you rooting for Briar the moment she stood her ground? Or did Atlas have you from the second he said, "You're coming home with me"? I need to know whose side you're on, and let me know if you want a part 2, because their reign is only just beginning. The vault is open. The next story is waiting. Don't miss it.